apparatus jumped on this and said, look, inspired by the wonders of Marxism, Leninism, this young scholar has done what none of the imperialist scholars in Britain or the United States or Germany could ever do. He's shown how the Maya wrote. And Thompson, a lifelong anti-communist, decided that this was a total fraud and that the world should be straightened out about this.
Some of Knorosov's specific readings were questionable. Seizing upon them, Thompson discredited his entire method. Tragically, Knorosov's priceless insights went unrecognized in the West. But the era of lone scholars scattered across the world was coming to an end. The change began in Palenque, driven by Merle Green Robertson. She had spent years documenting the site's art for future generations. While she was working, an art professor named Linda Sheely visited.
When I walked among Palenque's buildings, I saw a culture where the art was central. And I really was driven to understand who had done it and why and how.
Sheely began to help Robertson. As they worked, she gained an intimate knowledge of the site. It would be put to use in 1973, when Robertson hosted a conference at Palenque. There, Sheely met Peter Matthews, who had spent the past winter analyzing books of Palenque's glyphs.
Basically, by the end of that process, I had 3 huge notebooks filled up with transcriptions in Thompson's wretched T numbers of all the signs of every single inscription from Palenque.
Matthews teamed up with Sheely to reconstruct Palenque's dynastic history. They knew that some royal names at Palenque are accompanied by a title, a winged sun sign.
And so what we did is we went through and found every example of this title and wrote down the nearest date.
Poring over Palenque's inscriptions, they found over 40 names with the royal title. Each was accompanied by a date and glyph describing the event on that date. For example, a birth shown by the upended head of an iguana. As Sheely and Matthews arranged the births, deaths, and ceremonies by date, the patterns emerged. One ruler stood out, whom they dubbed Lord Shield. He was born on the 23rd of March, 603. His name glyph featured a warrior's shield. It led them to Palenque's most dominant building, the Temple of the Inscriptions. The meaning of its hieroglyphic tablets had been an enigma for centuries. Sheely and Matthews now saw that the panels were filled with references to Lord Shield and key events of his life. Suddenly, a discovery made in 1948 took on new meaning. A hidden staircase was found in the temple's inner chamber, leading to a crypt with a limestone sarcophagus. Inside was a human skeleton, masked in jade. Sheely and Matthews realized that this must be the body of Lord Shield. For the first time, hieroglyphs were connected to the remains of a Maya ruler. The glyphs Sheely and Matthews grasped traced the life stories of Lord Shield and 5 of his successors.
And they came out and literally announced that they had sort of cracked the dynasty of Palenque. And they had names of the rulers and the times when they ruled.
We had them with funny names like Sun Shield and a Lord Toothache.
At that point, Moises Morales, a local guide, jumped up and said, "Why is it that when important discoveries like this are made, the name is given in English, Lord Shield, or Escudo in Spanish?" He said, "These people spoke Maya."
So they called the king Pakal, a Mayan word later confirmed phonetically to mean shield.
It was just a giddy sort of feeling, and I'll never forget it. It was a real turning point in Maya studies.
After years of work, the cracking of the Maya code was within reach. But one big hurdle remained: to read the hieroglyphs aloud in the language in which they were written. The phonetic decipherment begun by Knorosov had to be completed. Despite decades of effort, fewer than 30 syllabic signs could be read with confidence. The final key to the sounds of the glyphs would be found by David Stewart, whose education as a Mayanist began at an early age. His father, George, often brought him along on field trips to Mesoamerica. One of David's most memorable expeditions was to Coba in the Yucatan.
It was just kind of an incredible place to wander around as a kid. What really got me, though, was while we were at Coba, there were a couple of monuments that were actually discovered. My dad would drop everything and work on drawing the monument. And I would just sort of look over his shoulder while he was doing that and thought, gee, you know, this is pretty amazing.
He decided he would go out and draw some himself. So he'd take his crayons and paper and everything and go out and started drawing hieroglyphs.
By the time we got back to the States, my inner soul had been so affected by that experience that I just wanted to keep going back.
Two years later, George took David to meet Linda Sheely.
I remember kind of sitting there quietly in the office while she was drawing a glyph, and I don't know why I blurted this out, but I said, "Oh, that's a fire glyph." And Linda kind of paused, and I remember she sort of looked behind her shoulder and over at me and said, "Yeah, you're right, kid, that's a fire glyph."
George said that they would really appreciate it if there was ever a chance that David could study with me or something. And so on the spur of the moment, I said, why didn't he come down to Palenque this summer?
And the next summer was one of the most amazing times of my life. She allowed me to help her check her drawings. You know, we were in the temples with flashlights, with her drawings on clipboards, making corrections. Now, I remember Linda was saying, "Okay, kid, you know, if you want to learn Maya glyphs, you gotta do it on your own."
I gave him the tablet of the cross, told him to go out on the back porch and figure out as much as he could about it. He came back a couple of days later and had the same amount of structural understanding of the text that it had taken me 3 years to do. And so I figured then that he was really quite good.
At age 12, David presented his first scholarly paper on Maya hieroglyphs.
And he gives a paper that was certainly beyond the abilities of about 2/3 or 3/4 of the audience to follow. It was a scholarly paper, and mostly people were just amazed.
Then, after his high school graduation, Stewart received an unexpected call. He had won a MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Award. At age 18, he was the youngest recipient ever of the prestigious prize. Stewart delayed college to work on the glyphs full-time. It was then that he made his great discovery. It came when he focused on a pair of signs already believed to have been deciphered. Eric Thompson had pointed out that one of these signs signaled a count forward to a new date. The other, a count backward to a prior date. The two glyphs shared a common sign, what Thompson called either a water sign or the head of a shark, or shok in Maya. Shok can also mean to count. But Stewart discovered that several other signs also substituted for the shark. A human head, a monkey, and in one instance, a bracket-shaped sign. Did all these signs stand for the word count? Stewart felt there was a simpler explanation. The bracket symbol was also the phonetic sign for the syllable oo. Suddenly, he realized that all these signs stood for the syllable oo. The proof? Each sign freely substituted for the oo bracket in contexts that had nothing to do with counting.
What Dave Stewart did was show us that many of these substitutions are purely phonetic substitutions that are spelling exactly the same word in slightly different ways.
The backward and forward counting glyphs were phonetically spelled phrases. E-U-T and utiya. In Maya, E-ut means and then it happened, and uti means since it happened. The words that Thompson had viewed as mere dates were in fact telling a story. And then it happened on the day 1 Kib 14 Kankin that she was adorned in marriage, Lady Khatun Ahau, Lady of Naman. And after 10 days, 11 months, 1 year and 1 score of years, then it happened on the day 4 Kimi 14 Wo that their daughter was born, the royal Sun Lady. The implications were revolutionary. Epigraphers had been searching for a single sign for each syllabic sound. But if oo was represented by more than one sign, then other syllables might be as well.
One of the things about Maya writing which makes it so complicated is their love of substitutions. One sound can have 13, 14, 15 different versions. They hated repeating themselves and loved showing new things. And the recognition of those substitution patterns was what began to break down the complexity of Maya writing into something which was a manageable, comprehensible system.
Each time a Maya scribe wrote a given word or phrase, he could choose from a variety of signs and combine them in new ways. A sign could be written abstractly, or as the head of a human, animal, or god. One sign could be slipped inside another, or partly overlapped. Two signs could join, merging their attributes. Glyphs even included figures of monsters and gods.
The art of the system is the genius within which they combine these different possibilities. The graphic component of Maya writing is absolutely overwhelming.
There was an artistry and a playfulness that was as much a part of the system as the recording of language. So visually it was complicated, but once you organize that visual material into the system that existed, it made perfect sense, and you could predict things. You could really crack the code that way.
An image of the ancient Maya was suddenly coming to life, gleaned from their own words. Some glyphs simply described personal possessions. Utupa, utup, his ear ornament. Ubaki, ubak, his bone. Ulak, his plate. Ukib, his drinking vessel.
They're describing particularly important objects belonging to the royal court. They're probably gifts, they're received, they're given. They're part of a social process that helps to bond these societies together.
It's like having a time machine to be able to read these texts. And to me, it's a rare privilege to be able to read them out loud in the language in which they were written. Maybe sometimes I'm the first person to actually say them out loud in 1,000 years.
Soon, more esoteric ideas emerged in the writing. There were glyphs describing frightening otherworldly beings.
These glyphs were appearing with scenes of these fantastic animals and creatures and spooky-looking walking skeletons. And this was a different kind of thing from what we were used to reading about in Maya glyphs. You know, they weren't talking about monuments, they weren't talking about warfare. They were talking about kind of the inner souls of people.
As the readings poured out, a more complex view of the Maya began to emerge.
Instead of these peaceful stargazing astronomer priests, the Maya were shown to be like any other civilization with a great deal of conflict. One of their great claims to fame was how many captives they had taken as offerings to their gods and ancestors. They would also periodically engage in the most precious offering of all, which was in offering their own blood.
The importance of self-sacrifice can be seen in this ceremony. A royal lady conjures a vision of a serpent with an offering of her own blood. She has perforated her tongue with a stingray spine to draw a rope embedded with thorns through the incision. In front of her, slips of paper soaked in her own blood burn in a ceramic bowl. Out of the rising smoke forms the vision of a serpent. From its mouth emerges the figure of an ancestor. The upper text describes the ceremony. On March 28, 755, a vision was conjured of the serpent Yash No Chan, the animal spirit of the god Kawil. And then a vision was conjured of the ancestor, Yash Chawim. The glyph for conjure shows a hand grasping a fish.
It's this idea of grabbing something that's elusive, reaching into another realm in a way, or even into the underworld and wrenching something out of that and bringing it into your own world. That is conjuring.
From glyphs and art, the psyche of the ancient Maya was emerging.
We now saw the Maya people as a whole. So you could look at a piece of Maya art and the inscriptions on the tops of the vases and understand what the heck these people were doing.
One myth, painted repeatedly on Maya vases, echoes a surviving 16th century manuscript, the Popol Vuh. It tells the saga of twin brothers summoned to the underworld.
They play a ball game against the lords of the underworld in which they are finally defeated. And they are sacrificed. The head of the main brother there is cut off and hung up in a tree. And a young lady comes by who is the daughter of one of the lords of the underworld. She talks to the head and it spits into her hand. Naturally, she becomes pregnant.
Banished from the underworld, she eventually gives birth to a second set of twins. They become skilled warriors and return to the underworld to fight its lords. After a series of clever tricks, they resurrect the body of their father, the maize god, and bring food back to their people. Then they rise up to become the sun and moon.
This is the single most important myth that we have from the entire New World. Probably the most important piece of literature ever produced in the Western Hemisphere.
The decipherment was not only illuminating the inner world of the Maya, but also casting new light on the power struggles tearing apart their great city-states. It became clear that from the 3rd to 9th centuries, the Maya world was dominated by warring superpowers.
We began to see blood everywhere in the iconography and in the hieroglyphs. They were not a peaceful people, but involved with absolutely bloody sacrifice.
In this sculpture, a captive has been scalped, disemboweled and crippled. Wood is tied to his back to set him on fire.
There were well-defined groups that were really at each other's throats, battling each other and causing havoc on the landscape.
The glyphs reveal the mayhem. Chuk, to capture. Hoob, to take down a city. Pool, to burn. Chuck, to decapitate. One scribe grimly wrote, "The